Story 1. Honestly, the first time I decided I was too old for Halloween and trick-or-treating, I didn't want to give up something I loved so much. However, I felt immense pressure to stop socially that I couldn't quite understand, and I couldn't ignore it no matter how much I wanted to. I have experienced traumatic events that stole my childhood before that, but I still played in leaves, had swamp fights, and wore sparkly tutus just because it was Tuesday. My first Halloween without Halloween was the first time I censored my behavior and stopped doing something I truly loved because it seemed childish. Even though I have reclaimed many of these things as an adult, it will never be quite the same since the thought of being childish as a negative crossed my mind. Story 2. At 14 years old, my older brother, who was 16, died of leukemia. My parents fell into depression for 7 years, leaving me on my own. I got into a lot of trouble but emerged okay on the other side. Story 3. I was in 4th grade when a teacher was bullying me, claiming I wasn't doing my homework and the extra assignments I was given. I was actually completing them, but he used this as an excuse to punish me and keep me in during recess and after school. He was trying to manipulate me and gain my parents' trust, pretending to be the good guy who could save me from my issues. No one believed me. I began self-harming and contemplated suicide. Then, one day, he drove me home in his truck after school, and my parents removed me from the school immediately. No one ever talked about it or offered an apology. Story 4. When I was 13, I asked my mom if I could go out to play. She told me I was too old for that. Here's why her response seemed unreasonable to me. This was during a time when teenage pregnancy was an epidemic. All I wanted to do was play. I resented her for this my entire life. What did she expect me to do at 13? Story 5. When I was 8 years old, my parents started leaving me home alone, deciding that their job of raising me was finished. I spent much of my childhood alone, and even when they were at home, they weren't really present and never seemed to truly care for me. They became people I lived with who would occasionally feed me when they remembered I needed to eat. Story 6. At around age 12, I realized my parents weren't cool, but simply allowed me to do whatever I wanted because they didn't care. They were mostly absent in my life. Much of the negative behavior I exhibited afterward was for attention I never received from them. Thankfully, my sister, who was 2.5 years older than me, stepped in and basically raised me, sacrificing her own teenage years. Story 7. It's always interesting to me how we all went out and played with our friends as kids, not knowing it was the last time. Story 8. When my great-grandmother passed away tragically, she walked outside in the middle of the night and froze to death. She had dementia. I will never forget that morning. I was 12 years old. I have never received more than 20 upvotes on a single post. Thank you all. May you find peace, happiness, and your way through the world. For those who care, I am in my late 30s now. Trauma has impacted me severely. Growing up quickly can do that to a person. I have battled addiction, depression, and anxiety for years. Thankfully, I am clean now and on my way to becoming the spiritual being I believe we all can be. That is significant, coming from someone who was once a borderline atheist and almost a Satanist at one point. Story 9. At 28, when my mom passed away, the final blow came at 30 when my dad passed as well. I realized then that I was an adult, a real adult, because I had no one to ask the difficult questions. Story 10. When I was 15, a few months after my birthday, my father was arrested for soliciting a minor. Thankfully, it was an internet sting operation, and no child was harmed. However, from the time my mother told me about the arrest until about a month after my 18th birthday, I have almost no memories. Felt as though I was living in a fog, just doing the bare minimum to get through life. Story 11. When my father molested me, I will never get justice, and I will never be okay again. I loved my dad. I am still trying to understand why I struggle to be vulnerable with anyone, even with myself. It has negatively impacted my life. Story 12. I just watched the quietly devastating film My Old Ass, starring Aubrey Plaza and Maisie Stella. And this line sums it up perfectly. Chad, do you remember the last time you went out with friends as a kid and just played pretend the whole day? Elliot, I remember doing that a lot. Chad, Do you remember the very last time you ever did it? Elliot. No. Chad. Isn't that sad? To think there was a time when you were biking around with your friends, pretending you were getting chased by zombies, all dirty and sweaty and having the best time. Then you went home, parked your bike in the garage, and went to bed, not realizing it was the last time you would ever get to do that. Story 13. Probably not one specific moment, and you may not notice right away, but when you realize it's your name being shouted when something goes wrong. As a child, things go wrong, like something breaks or someone gets hurt. You know who to look for. At some point, that person becomes you, and it hits you when you realize it's now your responsibility to resolve crises. Story 14. I was 8 years old. After a year and a half of severe bullying that would later result in a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder when I was 20, I attempted suicide for the first time. It was my most successful attempt, as by all accounts I was lifeless for at least a minute. My mother found me hanging from a scarf in my room and brought me back to life right there. Death itself is painless. Coming back hurts intensely. Air gets forced back into your lungs, and your nerves turning back on feels like electricity and full-body pins and needles, muscles spasming. But the worst pain came from feeling my mother trembling as she held me when I returned. She held me so tightly, and I could feel her shaking. I could hear her screaming and crying from having almost lost me. Nothing was ever really the same after that. The world lost some of its vibrant color and became a bit more gray. Part of me didn't come back from where I had been. Don't feel too bad for me, though. Once that school year ended, we moved to a new school district, one rated as one of the best in the state, if not the country. I got help for severe depression and numerous other issues I had. I made friends who recognized the pain I was in, even when I couldn't put it into words. In 2019, I graduated from high school with honors. Not bad for someone who died in 2008. That said, my childhood was over after that. From 2008 onward, I found myself in a strange limbo. I didn't do the normal childhood things. Perhaps if I had received better treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, I would have, but I wouldn't be diagnosed with that until much later. Oh well. Story 15. I started working for pocket money on weekends when I was 11. By 13, most people thought I was 18. I didn't get carded for drinks or cigarettes. I had a boyfriend who was 18 at the time. By 15, I was going to bars and getting drunk while still working on weekends and during school holidays. By 16, I had finished school in the United Kingdom and moved back to the United States with my dad. It was a massive culture shock because he treated me like a latchkey kid. My mom had always been a stay-at-home mom and had moved with me, but she was so depressed by her marriage that she didn't do anything around the house anymore. She moved back to England when I was 18. By 21, I was engaged and living with my fiancé. We divorced when I was 25. Story 16. My brother was about 5 years old and had just learned about death. Our secular parents explained it as a blank pit of nothingness. He feared it, but I thought death sounded peaceful. I was around 8 years old when the suicidal thoughts and fantasies began. Story 17. At age 7, I stood in the middle of our living room, sobbing and begging my parents to stop drinking. They stopped for one day, but the drinking resumed and continued for the rest of their lives. Story 18. It sounds a little dramatic, but September 11th is a day I remember vividly. I was 10 years old and sitting in class on the West Coast, so it wasn't immediately impactful for us. I recall my teacher being pulled out of the classroom and returning with tears in her eyes. School was dismissed for the day, and our parents were contacted right away. My mom came to pick me up, and nothing was said during the car ride home. I felt strange but also excited to have the whole day off from school. I ran inside, turned on the television, and switched to some cartoons, but then I saw the news. As I stared, too dumbstruck to change the channel, I witnessed a man hurl himself from a building. My mind instantly shifted to thoughts of, why would he do that? Before realizing, he didn't want to burn to death. He had no way out. There were heroes that day, but it's a somber lesson to learn that not everyone can be saved. There are things you can never account for or even imagine happening, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Story 19. When my mom bagged up all my dolls, including Barbies, baby dolls, Polly Pockets, and even porcelain dolls, and threw them in the trash while I was screaming, crying, and begging her not to, I wanted to know why. She had heard a sermon about how toys like those can affect a girl's mind and body image. Story 20. When my father died when I was 9, I had been living at a friend's house because my mom was at the hospital often. I thought we were having a really long playdate. Then one day, I got to stay home from school and returned to find my mom crying. Story 21. The night I had to keep my baby sister distracted with the movie about robots and a sock monkey doll while my parents were arguing in the other room. Story 22. When I realized that I could alleviate the nauseous feeling caused by my anxiety by inducing vomiting, I was 10 years old. Story 23. I was 6 or 7 when my mother put me out of the house. Why? I hadn't cleaned my room. It was early evening, getting dark, and I was standing on the lawn while she screamed at me from the front door. We lived 2 houses from the corner, and I remember walking toward the stop sign, trying to recall the route we would drive to get to my grandmother's house. In reality, I never could have walked there, but I was a child in survival mode. I got halfway to the corner, and she called me back. I never again felt like I could take for granted the safety of home. I was still a child for many years after that, but that night was a turning point in my psyche and emotionally scarring. There have been many incidents since that made me realize my mother resented my existence, and that her needs and emotions mattered to her in every situation. But that was the first of the traumatic interactions I can remember. Story 24. When I was 10, my mother died. My father had already passed away when I was 4 months old, so that was the end. Story 25. When my mother's boyfriend took something from me that I was unable to retrieve, I was treated as an adult from that moment on. Story 26. Mine ended at age 10 when my mother left my abusive father. She left me and my 2 younger sisters, aged 7 and 3 at the time, with a man who could not handle the fact that his wife left him. I have never felt pain like that. I was a mother's boy through and through. But I wasn't allowed any time to process what happened because the day she left, he picked up the bottle. He became an alcoholic, and I ended up having to look after him and my 2 younger sisters. I had to cook for them, bathe them, change diapers, and help potty train my youngest sister while still going to school, because he literally couldn't handle anything without having a mental breakdown. He had 2 stress-induced epileptic fits within about 6 months of each other. The first time was at dinner when he came into the living room, collapsed on the table, and had a seizure. I managed to get my neighbors to help call emergency services, and he was sent to the hospital. The second time he fell down the stairs, but I was prepared as I had requested CPR training at school. This time I called emergency services myself and made sure he was breathing. I sent my sisters to my neighbors and stayed with him. When the ambulance arrived, he called me his little lifesaver. Fast forward 2 years, my mother is back on the scene, and child custody battles ensue. In that time, he met a woman who was a source of child abuse. She disliked me intensely, and I felt the same way about her. Because of her and my father's need for a relationship outside of his responsibilities as a father, I decided to live with my mother. I haven't heard anything from him since. It's been nearly 20 years, and I am only just starting to get therapy and process everything that happened. I don't know if it's a good sign when your therapist turns around after you explain your background and says, "Jesus Christ, I hope I can move past all of this." Story 27. When I saw my father's lifeless body in front of our family portrait at the age of 7, it was because he took his life. Story 28. During the summer, my neighbor went to high school. He was older than me. His brother was a year younger. We all rode bikes and built forts in the woods together for the last time. Story 29. When I moved to another country, I had more freedom than in my home country. I relocated from Mexico to the United Kingdom, and I had to take care of myself without someone around all the time to ensure I was okay. That experience helped me grow up. Story 30. At 7 years old, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. My whole world turned upside down, and I had to grow up quickly, learning many things that most adults wouldn't understand. I became an educator for those around me because they didn't understand my condition. I lost friends and never got to celebrate birthdays at school. I spent half of recess in the nurse's office calculating carbohydrates. Now I am 23, and I've experienced many challenges in my childhood. But there are days when I wish for a redo on life. Story 31. When I realized my cousin was abusing me, I was 9 years old and had been aware of it since I was 4. I do not know when it started. Story 32. Being sexually assaulted by someone I thought was a friend at the age of 7 or 8. I hid it away, pretending it was okay, but I ended up lying to myself. Luckily, nothing else happened to me that added to the trauma. Story 33. Probably 6 or 7, whenever the neighbor's dad decided it would be fun to mess with me. That's why I carry. I couldn't stop anything back then, but I can make sure it never happens to me or anyone I love ever again. Story 34. When my parents took me on a trip to Spain to address their addiction, it didn't work, and I ended up alone in Morocco at 9 years old. Story 35. When I was around 17, my chronic pain became so severe that I had to stay home most of the time. As a result, all my friends stopped visiting or even messaging me. Story 36. When I left my hometown to go to college 700 miles away a year early at 17, I felt free. My childhood wasn't particularly terrible, but I have never missed it at all. Story 37. When my parents started going through my room and confronting me about adult magazines under my mattress and reading my diary, I know it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it felt like a significant invasion of privacy. I burned all my yearbooks, birthday cards, and letters I had saved. Everything meaningful was gone, and I still have major trust issues. Story 38. We watched our dog choke to death on a chicken bone in a pool of his own blood right before heading to church when I was about 5 years old. I decided then that there is no God. Story 39. I experienced an unwanted sexual encounter at the age of 13. Shortly after, I began receiving emails related to adult content and became consumed by it. Pretending was no longer enjoyable. My only desire was for romantic relationships. By age 15, I became a womanizer and started engaging in unprotected sexual activity, which was far too young. One of my greatest concerns for my sons is that they may not have the opportunity to enjoy a complete childhood. So far, they are doing well. Story 40. 5 or 6 years old, when neglect, abuse, household drama, fights, and substance abuse exploded. I didn't have a childhood. I had a life. I had to grow up extremely quickly. Story 41. Probably when a grown man put his hand on my knee and said I was jailbait, I told his girlfriend and she replied, "Well, he's not wrong." Story 42. When my parents made me get a summer job at 16, no summer has been the same since. It felt like a turning point because I worked that summer when I was 17 as well. After high school, I had a job and have maintained employment ever since. Story 43. I was 7 when he assaulted me for the first time, and my mother never believed me until she passed away. That man will face a slow and painful end. Karma is powerful. It is infuriating to think he worked at a reform school. Story 44. When The Undertaker lost for the first time at WrestleMania, it felt like the excited kid who had watched his unstoppable idol growing up was just gone. Story 45. When I got into a dirt bike accident at 18, just a few days after my high school graduation party, I took a 2-inch chunk out of my femoral artery in my left leg when I crashed, and the foot peg caused all the damage. I stood up, and it looked like someone had dumped a huge bucket of blood on me. I could see it coming out. My ex's dad came running out of the house with towels and applied pressure to my leg until the ambulance arrived. Everything was really hazy for me from that point on. I woke up the next day in the intensive care unit after emergency bypass surgery, and when it hit me that I should have been dead, I sobbed uncontrollably. Every time I see the scars on my legs, now 15 years later, I shiver a bit. But I thank my lucky stars for Todd Beatty for saving my life that day. Story 46. I witnessed someone get shot over a neighborhood dispute. I can still vividly remember the scream of the victim's mother to this day. Story 47. I never really had a stable family life. My parents divorced when I was 3 years old. I had an absent mother and an emotionally distant father. I was influenced by the internet of the early 2000s, while my father was preoccupied with other relationships and failed to provide proper care. As I grew up, I believed that my circumstances were my fault. In reality, I was born into near poverty and was fortunate to have basic necessities like clothing and shelter. I still struggle with unresolved trauma and multiple untreated mental health issues. Even now, I cannot afford treatment if I wanted to. Story 48. Despite going through multiple traumatic events, I still believe I am a child. I would like to retain my childlike enthusiasm and curiosity. Story 49. 5 months after starting high school, everything was going great when suddenly I became the target of a group of bullies from both my class and other classes. It became a daily ordeal not to break down. I dreaded going to school, and throughout the entire 4 years, I was ashamed of it and ultimately started believing what the bullies were saying. The abuse occurred during school hours as well as before and after school. My grades suffered, and so did my mental and physical health and hygiene. I became depressed, developed anxiety, and started having thoughts of torturing and killing my bullies. I also thought about taking my own life and attempted it twice. All this culminated in me failing several classes before graduation, forcing me to resolve them during summer break. As a result, I missed the first round of college applications and was left with only a few paid, dead-end college courses. I spent 5 years unemployed or doing short, off-the-record work while struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. I managed to get into a respectable college 5 years after my peers. There was a huge disconnect between me and the other 19-year-old students. I had trouble making friends and forming connections. I completed college, but during that time, the idea of a respectable degree became a joke. Good job prospects are now mainly automated or heavily dependent on personal or political connections, which I have none of. 32. I am still struggling with the same issues. I continue to have nightmares about my bullies. I feel like I wasted 10 years of my life. My peers have jobs, careers, cars, houses, spouses, and children, a stable, normal life. I have nothing. I lack experience and prospects. I feel like I should be a 20-year-old just starting out. Mock me all you want for this opinion, but the person I could have been was slowly tortured and destroyed. I feel like a waste of space because a few teenagers needed to vent their frustrations, and the adults who were supposed to be our educators chose to ignore the bullying instead of stopping it. Story 50. I never had a childhood. I grew up in a neglectful and abusive household. I was raped and abused from the ages of 9 to 12 by my primary school teacher. Story 51. When I went to middle school, people focused on clothes, boys, and things I did not understand yet. I transitioned from playing with everyone to navigating cliques and hierarchies. It was strange. Additionally, it was the first time my peers were sometimes very mean, and the teachers acted as if it was just part of the experience. Felt overwhelming. Story 52. I was 8, sexually harassed and threatened by a 9-year-old. The first and only adult I told said, "Boys will be boys." So I never informed my parents or teachers. The next day, the boy had been crying and telling everyone I said he raped me. I knew the difference and never said that. So all I could do was say no as other kids came over to ask or insult me for making the popular boy cry with lies I had never spoken. I learned that being popular meant being believed. I learned that no one would protect me. I learned that the friend who had supported me the day before suddenly turned on me despite the fact she had been there. So I stopped letting anyone in. No one was safe for me. It took me until my 30s to accept that this was trauma and still affecting me. Minimizing trauma is something I've done all my life after it was minimized by a friend's mother. I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder due to this and other separate traumatic incidents. But that is the moment I stopped wearing clothes I liked. Everything had to be plain and black. Nothing that would draw attention. I started thinking about self-harm. I didn't make friends again until I was 14. I was 8 and the world was unsafe. Story 53. At 12 years old, I was attacked by dogs owned by my neighbors while I was going to hang out with their daughter. It was a freak accident. They didn't mean to hurt me. They were just overly excited, and all 3 were intact males fighting over territory before I arrived. I had to mature quickly to provide police reports and testify in court. and my life was turned upside down. I knew it would never be the same after that, particularly regarding my mental state. Story 54. When I was 12, my mother threatened to leave my abusive father. He brought us into the bedroom at gunpoint and threatened to kill us. Clearly, he didn't, but you grow up fast after that. Story 55. I was sent to boarding school. I knew then that I would never be at home permanently again. My 11-year-old brain was correct. Story 56. During my preteen years, my mother frequently expressed thoughts of suicide. I understand it wasn't her fault. She was dealing with a lot, including the death of her brother, who was very close to us and lived with us. Additionally, she was in a relationship with a mentally abusive alcoholic, which took a toll on her. I don't blame her. She is an amazing mother who does everything for my brothers and me. Fortunately, she is recovering from her grief and left my father a few years ago, which has made her much happier. Story 57. At 16, I developed anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and severe intrusive thoughts due to emotional and psychological abuse from my parents. I lost my innocence and my true self that year, and I have never been the same since. Story 58. At age 7, I was tied up by my stepmother, who was a school teacher. Child Protective Services came, but they were unable to prove anything. My father, who was a police officer, either did not care or was oblivious, denying anything had happened and frequently changing the story whenever it was mentioned. My stepmother understood that she could physically touch us, while she yelled and screamed, becoming my personal bully for nearly 10 years until I ran away and confronted both of them. Story 59. I experienced severe bullying when I was around 10 years old, coinciding with a lot of family drama at home involving aunts, cousins, uncles, and parents. Within a year, there was a drastic change in my personality, like reality hitting me hard. Suddenly, I was constantly worried about everything I said and did, and what others thought of me. It became much harder to be a kid. Describing it as depressing would be an understatement. I barely spoke and submerged myself in books. Story 60. My first paycheck revealed the disappointment of realizing how much actually gets deducted for taxes. Suddenly, I cared about how the government spent my money. Story 61. I was abused by a family member at a very early age, but did not tell anyone until my teenage years. In middle and high school, I was responsible for getting my sisters ready for school. My parents were not always nice, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I revealed what happened with my uncle when I was 14 to protect my cousin's baby. I had to go through the court system. I was in and out of therapy for years. I started working at 17 and never stopped. I had my first child at 22, and she was my everything. A few years later, I experienced a tubal pregnancy and was told that I would never get pregnant again due to scar tissue. However, I had my second child at 31. Sadly, his father was murdered. Now, at 48, I am taking care of my mother, who is not kind to me and my children because she has Alzheimer's disease. My father has no one else to help him because my sisters are unreliable. I have arthritis and a herniated disc, so I am in pain constantly. I am waiting on disability benefits and doing food delivery services to make ends meet. I haven't seen my daughter in 5 years. I walk around smiling as if everything is okay because I learned to do that at an early age, but I feel broken and cry often. However, it brings me joy to hear the neighborhood kids outside laughing and playing. I have no friends because I do not fit in anywhere. I am a loner by choice and stopped dating years ago because I am tired of being let down. I know it is a lot to bear, but I do have some decent days. Story 62. When my mom died, or maybe 5 months before that, her decline meant no more outings or special moments with her. I was 11 years old. Story 63. At 11 years old on my birthday, my parents announced they were getting divorced. What followed was a collapse of my childhood, my family, and how I viewed parents, adults, relationships, and the legal system. After years of therapy, I am still dealing with the effects. I am about to be 25. Story 64. When I was 14, my little sisters and I were home alone when a strange man entered our backyard. I went to get my dad's pistol from the nightstand and made my sisters hide. I watched him from the upstairs window until he left, but I was prepared to confront him. Story 65. My father killed my brother when I was 11, 6 weeks before John F. Kennedy was assassinated. This experience troubled me throughout my life, but finally, at the age of 70, I am content and okay. Story 66. Sitting on a milk crate in Greenfield, Tennessee, at 1 in the morning as a 7-year-old while police pull numerous stolen guns out of my stepfather's car. Story 67. The day my observant mother handed me $200 cash and encouraged me to leave home. She drove me into town and dropped me off in front of a travel agency. A lady who worked there owned a small one-bedroom flat with no laundry that she was prepared to rent to me for $50 per week. But I had to wait for her to finish work before she could take me there. The flat turned out to be 2 suburbs away from where I worked, but our hours matched up, and my landlady was happy to provide transport each way as long as I kept the flat tidy and the rent up to date. To this day, I thank my mother for noticing that as a fairly large teenager, I was on the verge of physically confronting my abusive father and took steps to prevent it. Story 68. I never had one. My parents took me on a motorcycle to get diapers when it started raining. We were in a terrible accident. They thought I had died but brought me to the hospital anyway. Because the trip was for diapers, they considered the accident my fault, so I was potty trained immediately. This all happened when I was 22 months old. Things went downhill from there. I was doing the dishes at 3 and the family laundry at 4. At 5, I was molested by a school friend. At 8, I was sexually assaulted by a neighbor. At 11, I became fully responsible for my brother. My mother only came home to sleep, and my dad had joined the military and was stationed in another country. We moved far away when I was 14, and the new neighbor started a relationship with me that included sex. He was 26 and had 5 children. Story 69. At 15, I was a pallbearer for my 16-year-old cousin. He was one of my best friends, and he took his own life. Story 70. At around 8 years old, my grandfather sexually abused me and my 6-year-old brother. My brother recently passed away in August at the age of 44 due to alcoholism, his coping mechanism. My father also passed away at 55. I am 46 now, and I have ended the cycle of generational trauma with my 3 children. Story 71. It never will. I am much closer to death than birth now, but why should my childhood end? You learn when you need to be sensible, and when you do not, that is maturity. Never kill your inner child. Never stop playing or seeing the wonder in the world. Story 72. Did you intend to ask for everyone's experiences with abuse or sexual assault? Because that is what you will receive with this question. Story 73. Legally, I became an adult at 18, but I truly felt I had come of age when I moved out and was able to support myself. Story 74. I never really had my own identity. As the youngest in the family, I watched whatever my brothers watched. My mom was in college full-time and worked as well. I learned to cook early on, often making her lunch and dinner. I could never have friends over or go to their houses. We moved so often that I preferred not to have belongings to pack for the next move. It became tiring to make friends, so I ended up sitting alone, reading, and avoiding close relationships with others. Story 75. At some point, I had to start being my mother's personal therapist. I'm not sure exactly when, but it was much earlier than it should have been. I had to console her about fights between my parents, encourage her when she felt inadequate at work, and reassure her that she was a good mother. The list goes on. I was her emotional support child for as long as I can remember. Story 76. At 11, I experienced a traumatic event. It significantly impacted my childhood, especially when confronted with adult situations. I didn't even know there were words to describe what happened to me until I was about 15. Story 77. When I received a chemistry set and attempted to use it to harm myself, I was around 12 years old. Experiencing religious trauma, my parents' divorce, and their efforts to turn me against each other, along with being bullied at school, led me to believe that if I died, I would enter the realms of the gods. Story 78. My first memory is being abused by my father and his friends. From as far back as I can remember, I took care of my twin brother, who has special needs, and I also had two other siblings for whom I felt responsible. This began when I was around 5 years old and continued until I moved out. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I needed to protect my siblings. It was incredibly difficult to endure abuse while maintaining my education and caring for them. Eventually, when I was old enough at 16, I managed to get myself and all my siblings out of that situation. Now, we live in a much more stable environment, and I am happiest that my youngest brother, who is 4 years old, finally gets to experience a real childhood. Story 79. I was 8 years old when my mom stopped showing me affection. I was also molested by a random child on the playground at 5, and as I grew up, many boys tried to be sexual with me. Story 80. I was sexually abused at the age of 7. At 9, I was diagnosed with a rare disease and underwent 4 separate surgeries, followed by several months of treatment and hospital stays. Afterward, I spent a much longer time in recovery at home, confined to bed rest. Once I finally recovered, my mother became pregnant with my brother. She had to work, and from then until I moved out at 18, I was responsible for his care, as well as for my grandmother, her sister, and household chores. Story 81. September 11th, 2001. I was a few days into my sophomore year of high school, and the whole world changed. There was talk of war, everything got locked down, our parents became very concerned about our safety, the 1990s vibes instantly faded, and we were thrust into an entirely new culture. Nothing felt the same after that. Story 82. My first memory is the search party for my younger brother's body. It will have been 40 years this coming May. Story 83. At 11 months old, when my younger sister was born, she took my crib. After that, I was expected to help raise her and every child that came after her. I spent what would have been my childhood changing diapers, feeding babies, and hiding them from my abusive father to prevent him from harming one for crying. Story 84. I was bullied for being queer to the point that I wanted to end my life at 14. My mother was not accepting, but she has made progress since then. My father simply told me that he loved me, but he passed away suddenly less than 6 months later. My childhood effectively ended at 15. The beautiful thing is that I now realize how precious childhood is, and I have embraced much of that childlike wonder as an adult. It took a lot of work and healing, but life has gotten so much better. Story 85. I came home from an errand to find my mother with a suitcase packed, waiting for a taxi, and my brother crying. She was leaving us for another man and was also leaving us to tell our father and younger sister. I was 17 and my brother was 19. With nearly 30 years of hindsight, I understand her motivations much more, but nothing can undo that moment for me. Things went completely wrong for a long time. Story 86. When I found my dad's oxycodone pills at 13 years old, I was getting so high that I could hardly function. I am now 8 years clean, so there is that. Story 87. The realization that my childhood had ended came at 12 when my grandparents seemed to give me free rein. While I hesitate to say they abandoned me, the lack of encouragement after age 12 was noticeable. I had great talents and wished I had a stronger support system to nurture them. Instead, I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol, facing behavioral problems due to years of abuse I couldn't discuss. When I started my period, my grandmother shamed me by throwing a pack of pads at me and telling me to keep clean, and that was pretty much it. Now, I have 2 beautiful children and about 10 years of therapy. My oldest graduates next year, and they are so worried about never being able to play video games or climb trees again. I still climb trees with them, play video games, and participate as much as I can to feel that sense of adventure. Life is good. Story 88. When I turned 10, my dad died when I was 4. I had 2 older siblings. We moved from Texas back to Michigan. We lived at my grandparents' house first, but it was small. Then my mom got an apartment and later she bought a house. She had to work all the time to provide for us. Mostly, my grandparents, aunt, and cousins would watch us. When I was 8, my mom met my stepdad. He was a great guy who loved us, taught us everything, and read us books before bed. He did things with us. Then, 2 years later, they got married when I was 10. The moment they got married, everything went downhill. My siblings and I were running around outside after the wedding, and we almost ran into my stepdad. He grabbed me by the arm and told me to stop misbehaving because he was my dad now and I needed to listen to what he said. My siblings and I were confused because he had never talked to us like that before. My mom ended up losing her job. We learned that my stepdad was an alcoholic, and my mom fell into a deep depression and turned to alcohol. Essentially, she checked out and allowed my stepdad to handle the discipline, but not in a good way. He was emotionally and physically abusive. He and my mom would constantly fight, sometimes physically. We stayed in our room most of the time. He eventually threw away all my toys. The only things I had left in my room were my bed, dresser, and clothes. I started hating my mom because she wouldn't do anything to help us. She would go to work, come home, and start drinking. By the time I got home from school, she was already drunk. On her days off, she would start drinking at noon. I hated weekends because they would both be home and they would start drinking by noon. I mostly went and stayed at the park all day. We told our grandparents what was going on and begged them not to tell my mom. We found out that my grandparents hated my stepdad and did not want her to marry him. My grandparents did tell my mom, and we got grounded for telling them lies. When I was 16, I became very depressed and started self-harming. The school found out first and contacted my mom. She put me in therapy. I told the therapist everything on the first visit. She called my mom back, explained why I was so depressed, and offered solutions to help. My mom never took me back, saying I didn't need it and that all I wanted was attention. Thankfully, my school offered me therapy, but it was only once a month. To this day, my mom does not remember how bad my stepdad was because she was mostly drunk. He ended up taking his own life when I was 23. My siblings and I still discuss our childhood, but she denies it ever happened. My brother and I ended up going to therapy for years to help us. Sadly, my sister thought she didn't need it and is still struggling. Story 89. When I was 12, I went to a sleepover and experienced what a slightly functional family looks like. When I came home, I realized that although I was loved, my family was dysfunctional. I always felt like I had to be mature beyond my years. Story 90, easy one for me. I lost my father when I was 13 years old. This was the culmination of my childhood. Story 91. When my mom had a nervous breakdown and poured gasoline on us kids while we were sleeping, my dad and I took her to a local mental hospital. I ended up seeing her in a straitjacket for her protection. I was 9 years old. Story 92. Around 4, my sister was adopted from an Eastern European country. She was essentially raised as a feral child after 6 years of neglect and starvation, and we spent the rest of our childhoods trying to help her catch up. Story 93. I think the first time I realized an adult didn't really care about my story, they were just placating me. This is completely fair, and I feel it is a significant development to recognize the world and perspectives outside of myself. Story 94. I had a 6th grade teacher who hated my older brother, and that animosity was passed down to me. She made me feel small and unintelligent. She openly mocked me in front of the entire class. She read aloud the few bad grades I had as an example of why I was a poor student. She was determined to destroy my self-esteem, and it worked. Took me a few years to find myself again. I still feel crushed when I think about how I felt throughout that whole school year. You couldn't pay me to go through that again. It really ended my bright-eyed, happy-go-lucky childhood. It hardened me. Story 95. I feel like I never really had much of a childhood. My mother wasn't very interested in what I was doing. She worked evenings, which I appreciate for helping to pay the bills, and we lived in my grandparents' basement suite. I usually got up and went to school, but they were there. When I was 10, my grandmother died, and my grandfather passed away when I had just turned 12. We moved to an apartment and I had to take care of myself. Story 96. Generation X here. My childhood ended the day I received the house key and was told not to answer the door for anyone. I was around 7 or 8 years old. Story 97. I was 14 years old when I started thinking I was an adult, so I began doing what I thought adults did. I started drinking because that is what I saw them doing, and I also abused pills. Now I am 25, and I feel disgusted with my younger self from 14 to 18 years old. I became bored on a weekend alone and consumed 7 shots of tequila a day for 3 days. I do not know why I engaged in those behaviors, but they really messed up my life for a while. My parents had and still have no idea about the extent of it. I do not drink or engage in any activities that could intoxicate me now. Story 98. When my childhood best friend died, it was 2 weeks before her 23rd birthday. I know I was an adult when she passed, but it feels like that's when all the childlike fun stopped in my life. Story 99. When I watched a stranger drive away with my dog, I was 17 and my parents were getting a divorce. We were selling the house and no one could take my dog. We sold him online. I can still see his face looking out the back window as they drove away. I never saw him again. I am 38 now. I never got over it and I never will. Story 100. My grandmother passed away. It turned out she had been managing most of my mother's mental illness and protecting me from it. She did not make arrangements for who would care for my mother after her death. Perhaps she assumed my aunt would take over. She did not. My mother struggled significantly and remained in that state for a long time. I learned a lot about responsibilities like paying the electric bill and understanding schizophrenia. I was 13 or 14 years old. I also discovered who truly cared about me and who did not. It was a challenging experience. Story 101. Probably when I developed excessive self-awareness and an anxiety disorder in 5th or 6th grade at the age of 11 or 12 after being bullied since the 1st grade at age 6. I also realized during that time that my father does not care about me or my family and that he is an alcoholic. Story 102. When I was the one solving problems around the house and not my parents, it felt significant, but I felt so small in that moment. I realized they wouldn't always be there to help or even be capable of doing so. That being said, I think my inner child is still very much alive, as I recently felt devastated over my we not turning on. I can't help but consider that this is not how someone who is mature would react. Story 103, February 24th, 1982, at 3 p.m. I was raised by a single mother, and when she died, I was orphaned, destitute, and homeless all at once. I was 17. Story 104. When I came home on my first leave, instead of the typical reception from my family, my grandfather stood up, walked across the yard, and shook my hand. Story 105. When my partner attempted suicide for the first time, we were 16 and 17 and had no resources for help. Story 106. When I got my first iPod Touch in 6th grade, I stopped reading, playing with friends, and going outside. I just got sucked into the rabbit hole of social media pressures and internet addiction. Story 107. When I was 14, riding the school bus with the boys' baseball team, I was the sports photographer for the school paper. We passed the athletics field and saw my best friend and my boyfriend walking shoulder to shoulder, holding hands and swinging their arms, carefree and happy. The entire bus turned to look at me. Story 108. My best friend died in a farming accident when I was 12. As my family was highly dysfunctional, the situation was not handled well. It wasn't a conscious decision, but upon reflecting on my life, it seems that was also the time I became a juvenile delinquent in the eyes of my school, family, and community. Here's a tip. If your child's friend dies in a tragic accident, do not take the child to the scene for the recovery of the body. And definitely do not adopt the attitude of just get over it to help the child afterward. It can be challenging when parents have their own struggles, such as those who are combat veterans dealing with trauma and alcoholism. Story 109. 10 years old, both brothers were killed in a car accident on their way home from high school. I had to take care of the family. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.